Good evening, folks. We'll start in a moment, allow more people to join us. I see some familiar names here already, and I look forward to seeing others. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll start in a moment. Just so you know, we are recording this event, and we'll provide some more instructions and context and introductions in a few seconds. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We'll give it another minute and then start this conversation. We're waiting for more people to show up. Hopefully they will. All righty, we'll start it now and then give it a go. I'm hopeful that I know that people will join us as we start. Good evening, everybody. First of all, I'd like to inform you that this event is being recorded. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to Avis Koyman and Srusti Soresh for all their assistance behind the scenes. They do everything and anything to make this and all other events possible, and I am grateful. I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us today for a special webinar titled October 7th, 2023, Israel in the United States, 2 years later, featuring Dr. Chuck Freilich, whom I'll introduce in a moment. I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity and mention that our next webinar is titled Between 2005 and 2025, the Israeli disengagement from Gaza 20 years later. Again, another timely topic, this time featuring Dr. Arnon Degani. It will take place online on Tuesday, October 28th, 2025 at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. 2 days ago marked the second anniversary of the horrendous Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023. In the months and years that followed that horrific day, the United States has been deeply enmeshed as a mediator, security partner, and diplomatic interlocutor. We have witnessed cycles of conflict, ceasefires, humanitarian crises, and shifting regional alignments since. Yet earlier today, reports emerged that Israel and Hamas have signed off on the first phase of a U.S. proposed ceasefire and hostage exchange agreement. Today's discussion focuses on how the U.S.-Israel relations have been reshaped by the war in Gaza, by the growing political tensions between the two countries over this past couple of years, and shifting public opinion in the United States, but also in Israel. The ceasefire deal, while tentative, highlights both the enduring influence and emerging limits of American diplomacy in the region. But given the momentous developments of the last day, I am sure that we are also hopeful that this webinar will further explore the several related questions that I kind of thought about. What does the next phase of U.S.-Israel relations look like? What are the geostrategic implications of this agreement and possibly enhancing it further? And what is the role that the United States will be playing in shaping a more stable and possibly, hopefully, peaceful Middle East? It is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Chuck Freilich is a former Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel, a longtime senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, where we first met. And he has taught political science classes at Harvard, Columbia, NYU, and Tel Aviv University. He's the author of several very important books dealing with Israeli national security. He has published numerous academic articles, over 150 op-eds, and appears frequently on U.S., Israeli, and international TV and radio stations. And I cannot really think of something or somebody more suitable to help us better understand the evolving situation on the ground and possibly look into the future and see what's waiting around the corner. As always in these events, Dr. Freilich will talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we will open the floor for Q&A and a conversation perhaps that I will moderate. Please Don't forget to type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Don't forget that the question is a sentence with a question mark. If you have comments, that's fine, but please let's try prioritize questions that are always driving the conversation further. Dr. Freilich, the floor is yours, my friend. Go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank Professor Saltzman, my old friend, for the invitation to be with you tonight, and Avis for all the work that she did to put this together. It's deeply appreciated. And of course, thank you all for joining. And I think we all owe a special thanks to President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu for arranging this deal just on the day that we're meeting. It was very nice of them to be so considerate. On a more serious note, this is a very, very important day, and hopefully we will be getting our hostages back in a couple of days, and a very, very long and painful war will be coming to a close. And I want to really provide a quick overview of where we stand at the end of 2 years. But first, let me start by reminding ourselves, October 7th was not just about the Hamas massacre. It was more than that. We now know from captured documents that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran were actually planning an event which wasn't supposed to be just limited to the massacre in the south, but as a matter of fact, Iran and Hezbollah were supposed to have joined in completely, and this was supposed to be a war for Israel's annihilation. And so to me, and I think it's critical to keep this perspective in mind. There is what to criticize about what Israel has done in these 2 years, but to remember that in effect, Hamas is not very different from the Nazis, except in capability. Their intentions were very similar. This was a war about Israel's annihilation. Fortunately for us, Iran did not join in the beginning, and Hezbollah only did partly. But in any event, this was a war which had to be won, at least militarily. And so where are we at the 2-year point? And let me address this on a number of levels. I'll start with the purely military level. And I would say that at the end of 2 years, it's actually quite remarkable. Israel has never been stronger, at least in recent memory. Hamas has been defeated militarily. It has not been destroyed, but it has been defeated. Hezbollah, which was the #1 threat that we faced short of a nuclear Iran, has been decimated. 70 to 80% of its rocket and drone force was destroyed. The Syrian regime collapsed, largely because Israel had weakened Hezbollah, which was one of the pillars of the regime. And lastly, but not far from least, Iran itself has been greatly weakened, both in the 2 rounds between Israel and Iran last year, or Israel and the United States and Iran, I should say, and the June war. And it's almost unimaginable how much better Israel's military position is today, especially if one takes into account how things started. But no one ever thought that we could deal this kind of defeat to our adversaries. There's the Hebrew expression, Yemot Mashiach, the days of the Messiah, just about. Politically, things are not as successful and not as favorable. Hamas is still, in effect, the ruling body in Gaza. And one of the disadvantages of the deal that was signed is that I don't believe that they will be demilitarized or really pushed out of this position as the governing body. There may be others who are officially in control, but in reality, I believe that they will continue to be so. Israel has not, throughout these 2 years, has not yet formulated its own vision for the day after. Well, now we have the Trump plan. Finally, after 2 years, we're hopefully getting the hostages back. But it was taken a very long time to do that. let me look at the strategic level. Hamas, to a certain extent, has achieved its objectives in the war. First of all, its minimal objective was simply to survive as an organization, because it knew that Israel was much stronger. It wanted to, the minimum objective was to cause Israel as much pain as possible, but to survive as an organization. They have done that both militarily and politically. They brought the Palestinian issue back on the international agenda, big time. We now saw France, the UK, Canada, Australia, a number of other nations. The end result of the massacre of October 7th was them recognizing a Palestinian state. And whether one believes that that is or is not the right thing to do, this certainly was the wrong context in which to do it. Normalization with Saudi Arabia and others has been derailed. I hope not permanently, but it has certainly been postponed. Hopefully that will change. Hamas also succeeded in internationalizing the conflict in a way that the Palestinians have never succeeded in the past, because now we're supposed to have an international governing body and an international force in Gaza. Now, a deal that leaves Hamas in power is, from their perspective, a victory. All they wanted was to survive this war. Now, of course, what kind of victory is it when Gaza has been devastated and tens of thousands of civilians have been killed? I think by our standards, this is anything but a victory, but by their definition, it is. And a victory feeds the appetite, whets the appetite for further rounds in the future. Well, if the Trump plan succeeds, then maybe this won't happen. But as things stand at the moment, maybe the most likely outcome of the war is that Israel will remain in Gaza for the long term. And that, I believe, would be a tragic outcome. Maybe the biggest victim of the war is the two-state solution, which was already on life support before the war began. And it's important to understand that even the left in Israel no longer believes that it's a realistic option, at least for the foreseeable future. And the reason is that if what happened on Israel's southern border, a relatively sparsely populated border, could happen, well, imagine if it happened on the West Bank border, which abuts all of Israel's population centers. The West Bank surrounds Jerusalem on three sides, surrounds, if you will. It's just a few miles from Tel Aviv, and it literally abuts all of the northern and southern suburbs of Tel Aviv. So this is something that, I mean, it's a nightmare for Israel. No one believes that one can have effective security measures anymore. Well, how do we get around that? How can we go forward? If we have time, I'll say a few minutes. I'll say a few words about that afterwards, and if not, if you want, in the Q&A. Some of the more effective strategic outcomes is that Iran is no longer a threshold nuclear state. Its nuclear program wasn't completely destroyed, but it was set back by probably 2-3 years. It's not on the threshold as it was before the war. There are major changes underway in Lebanon, an attempt to disarm Hezbollah, which has been greatly weakened, and not just militarily. Israel did that, but it's been weakened politically as a result. I would say that this is the best opportunity for a more moderate, peaceful Lebanon than we've faced in the last 60 years. In Syria, there's a new regime which is virulently anti-Iranian and which was blocking off military aid from Iran to Hezbollah. And on the strategic level, maybe the last point I'll make is, and this is not this is a very negative one, is that Israel's international standing is at an all-time low. And that is something that I am very concerned about, because it has ramifications in all areas, diplomatic, economic, military. And I'm especially concerned about the impact on the relationship with the U.S. Now, here there's good news and bad news. The good news in the relationship with the US is that the war produced unprecedented levels of strategic cooperation between the two countries, things that 2 years ago we simply could not have contemplated. So under Biden, we had the first two cases in history of joint Israeli-American defensive operations to counter the Iranian missile attacks in April and October of last year. We had some limited joint offensive operations against the Houthis in Yemen, but then we had the first real joint offensive operations, you can almost say a joint war, in June against Iran. The downside here is that I believe the war postponed for about a year, but then greatly amplified an impending crisis in the bilateral relationship. And I believe that if there is anything that is really existential for Israel, somehow we'll handle the Iranians, somehow the Palestinian issue will be resolved. But if there's one thing which really is existential, that's the relationship with the US, because we need the US for everything. Whether it's the Iranians, whether it's the Palestinians, whether it's Hezbollah, whatever. And there's been a precipitous drop in support on the Democratic side, and we see signs of weakness, of decreasing support on the Republican side as well. Well, the secret to the relationship in the past was that it was a fully bipartisan relationship. And the most worrisome thing is that the one part of the relationship that was always sacrosanct, if you will, was military aid. So you could criticize Israel for a whole variety of things over the decades, but the one thing that everyone agreed you don't touch was military aid. Well, now the Democrats are speaking explicitly about making military aid contingent on changes in Israel's policy, and we recently saw the first vote in Congress in which a majority of Democrats even voted against a military package for Israel. In terms of the Palestinians, well, we start out, as I said, with what Hamas considered to be a dramatic success. Of course, if you define massacre, mutilation, and rape as being a success, it ends with a partially successful outcome for them, as I said, because they survived. And at the same time, I think that most Palestinians will have to recognize that this is probably the greatest catastrophe that they've suffered since 1948, and maybe including 1948, the so-called Nakba, what the Palestinians call their tragedy of 1948. Well, many more people were killed in this war than in 1948. And the devastation that the Palestinians have suffered doesn't compare to what happened then. Now, I regret every Palestinian civilian casualty. And it's hard to say. I mean, clearly there were cases where maybe we could have done things differently. But first of all, I believe that the primary blame should be put on the side that not only started the war, but which intentionally and consistently places its weapons among civilians, next to hospitals, in hospitals, schools, community centers, because Hamas actually wants a lot of civilian casualties, because they know that the more casualties that Israel causes trying to take out the rockets and other systems, the greater the international opprobrium. And of course, they've said that they would be happy to continue doing more October 7th as often as possible in the future. I said before that I think the worst casualty of the war is the two-state solution. The Second Intifada and Arafat's rejections of the proposals on the table at Camp David and the Clinton parameters in 2000 decimated Israel's peace camp. It hadn't recovered to this day. Then along comes October 7th. And as I said, no one believes anymore that you can really get the security arrangements, which are Israel's rock bottom demand in any peace agreement. What do we want out of peace with the Palestinians? Well, peace, no more war. It would be nice if we could have a friendly relationship, but the bedrock demand is security. And after October 7th, if we don't believe we can get that, then how do we reach a two-state solution? I think that there is a good chance, it may be surprising to say this on the background of the recent recognition of Palestinian statehood and signing the deal today, which has a component which talks about a peace process and Palestinian independence. I tend to think that the Palestinians have probably missed their historic opportunity to ever have a fully independent state. Now, that's their tragedy. That has severe ramifications for them, but it also has severe ramifications for us, for our long-term future as a Jewish and democratic state, for our standing in the world, and for our security as well. The plan, the Trump plan, is based on benchmarks. This isn't some sort of blind article of faith. The Palestinians will have to prove themselves for the plan to go forward. So yes, we have, or by the time the refugees or the hostages are released, we'll have withdrawn to a first line. But the continuation beyond that, assuming that the hostages are released, depends on Hamas's living up at least to most of their commitments. Well, the truth is that the Palestinians have been put to test time after time ever since the Oslo Accords began. I mean, what was Oslo all about? Many people think that that Oslo was a peace agreement calling for a Palestinian state. That's a complete fallacy. It's not even a misreading of the agreement. It's just not what the agreement said. The agreement was a framework agreement for 5 years, which set out the parameters for negotiations, but said nothing about the final outcome, because the Israeli position at the time under Prime Minister Rabin was that, well, we're going to put the Palestinians to test and see if they can govern effectively in terms of their domestic autonomy, and if they can put an end to terrorism. The Palestinians failed that test, and in the West Bank, instead of governing responsibly, they set up a dictatorship in the West Bank, and they set up a radical theocracy in Gaza. And then in 2005, there's the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, again as a test, and as an indication that this isn't Gaza first and Gaza last, but there's a continuation. Israel dismantled 4 settlements in the West Bank as well, and said, if things go well, if you guys prove that you can, if you, the Palestinians, prove that you can now govern effectively, now put an end to terrorism, then there will be a continuation in the West Bank. And what we got instead was 20 years of tens of thousands of rockets and, of course, a 2-year war. The Trump plan, I think it requires a leap of faith to believe that Hamas will be disarmed and will cease to be the de facto government in Gaza. Now, you can say, well, if that's the case, then Israel doesn't have to go ahead with implementing the agreement. I think that's also a leap of faith, because the American pressure will be such that Israel, I think, will have very, very little alternative but to continue to implement the entire agreement. I don't want to say regardless of what happens, but just about. And so, as someone who was a lifelong supporter of the two-state solution, I believe that we have to look today at new ways of separating from the Palestinians, new ways of maybe achieving just about full Palestinian independence, but short of it. Because, as I said before, I think the Palestinians have probably missed their historic opportunity to have a fully independent state. Iran. I think the outcome of the June war was actually far better than the American media have led on. There was a certain, I think, reluctance to credit both Trump and Netanyahu with a success. But the nuclear program was set back by certainly 2-3 years. If we're lucky, maybe more. Now, I believe that the only way to ensure that Iran does not go nuclear for the long term is through a nuclear deal, a good nuclear deal. All of the other options, military options, they buy a limited period of time. Subversion, Israel and the US, but certainly Israel has conducted a number of both cyber and non-cyber kinetic attacks and damaged the Iranian nuclear program repeatedly over the years. That bought time. Sanctions were enough to get the Iranians to agree to the deal in 2015, not to give up the program. Regime change could be a long-term solution, but who knows when regime change will happen in Iran. I think the best assessment is any time in the next 5 minutes or 50 years. We simply don't know. And so that leaves us with the diplomatic option as being the best of the alternatives. At the moment, the Iranians don't seem to want to come back to the table, at least on the basis of any terms that are acceptable to the US. And Trump seems to be happy to continue simply with the threat of military force if and when it's needed. If Iran is reconstituting the nuclear program, Israel will also want to maybe the American approval to use force if we see the ballistic missile program being reconstituted as well. A good deal, to my way of thinking, is one ideally which would be indefinite, but at least it should be decades long. It should bar Iran's route from crossing the nuclear threshold for decades. It has to allow 24/7 inspections in all sites. Iran would have to essentially eliminate, or just about eliminate, its stockpile of enriched uranium and ship it out to a third party. It would have to destroy or limit the number of advanced centrifuges it has. And there'd have to be a prohibition on the weaponization programs. The other question is whether it should also include, and Israel would certainly want this, a limit on the ballistic missile program, the drone program possibly, and on Iran's regional role, its support for its proxies, because I think it's quite likely that Iran will try to rebuild the proxies. At the moment, there is certainly a unique opportunity to pressure Iran, if necessary, to take further military action, if they decide to reconstitute. Iran's air defense system was mostly destroyed already before the war and almost completely destroyed during the war. So we have a window in which they're particularly vulnerable. I don't know when that window will be closed. It's certainly months, maybe it'll be another year or two. It's not forever because China or Russia eventually will step in and make up what they lost. The axis of resistance, in other words, the proxies, and primarily Hezbollah and Hamas the axis lies in ruins at the moment, but that's also not forever. They will also rebuild over time. And I think that the war is going to have to require an in-depth review of Israel's national security strategy. Some of this has already happened, but there's a limit to how much you can do while a war is being waged. Clearly, the strategy was based on a number of false assumptions. First of all, the government believed that we could go ahead with regional normalization with the Saudis and others without regard to the Palestinian issue. And the Palestinians, Hamas, showed us that that was a mistake. We thought that Hamas could be bought off its quiescence could be bought off through economic inducements. Now, nobody ever thought that they gave up the long-term goal of Israel's destruction. Nobody was that naive in Israel, but it was thought that we could at least gain significant time by helping them progress economically and focus their attentions there rather than on the war against us. We thought that having intelligence superiority ensures early warning in the event of attack. Another mistake. We believed that we could achieve decisive victory over Hamas and Hezbollah without major American assistance. Another error in retrospect, because we needed far more American assistance than anybody thought. Because this turned out to be a multi-front war, and it could have been an even bigger, it could have been an all-out multi-front war. Had it just been Hamas, then the assumption would have been correct. But once Hezbollah was in it, and Iran was threatening to get in from the beginning and got in a couple of times on a limited basis, once it went in that direction, we needed Israel. And so the question is whether there are a number of specific mistakes that were made, and if they're corrected, that's enough. Whether, of course, this was a colossal intelligence and operational failure on October 7th, but assuming that hopefully we don't do that again in the future. So are these specific things that have to be corrected, or is there a need for a more comprehensive, fundamental reassessment of the national security strategy? We're going to have to maintain a much larger regular army and a much larger reserve army than we have done for years. A significant portion of the previous reserve army was released a number of years ago because it was thought that we don't need them anymore. And much of the ground army was Israel's mothballed or sold off a significant percentage of its tank force because it was thought that you don't need that anymore. Well, we're going to need all of that, bigger reserves, bigger regular army. We desperately need more conscripts today. The defense budget has already skyrocketed. We'll have to continue doing so for years to come. We're going to have to become at least somewhat more independent in domestic production, at least of munitions. Israel can't produce its own planes, its own artillery. It can't produce all the major weapons, but at least rockets and ammunition, artillery shells, things like that, and many, many subsystems we're going to have to become more independent in. Israel has already adopted a more offensive strategy than it has pursued in recent decades. And the IDF, basically the position is today we will try and preempt threats wherever we see them without waiting for them to attack first. And that's a big change compared to the recent decades. And let me conclude with one final issue. All of the above, everything that I've talked about, the war against Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the severe change in Israel's international standing, all of this has taken place in the context of a 6-year-long domestic political crisis. Between 2019 and 2022, so 4 years, Israel had 5 elections. There's a good chance we will have early elections, maybe spring 2026 instead of October. So this has been a period of extreme political instability. It's been a period in which we had the judicial reform in 2022 and 3. I consider it to be not a judicial reform, but a judicial wrecking ball, which threatened Israel's both the legal system and the democratic system. The government restarted that process again this year, even while the war was still underway. I believe that the prime minister has been willing to go to all lengths, just about, certainly to unacceptable lengths, in pursuit of his own personal interests, his legal and political interests at the expense of the nation. And he has put Israel's security at risk. I was going to say more about that, but let me leave it at that and turn it over to Professor Saltzman and to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Freilich. Thank you so much. This was a very, very interesting overview of these strategic issues. I'd like to kind of take a step back with your permission and talk about the U.S.-Israel relations over the past couple of years. And there was major changes or differences in variation, fluctuations over the years. And again, as an observer looking from Israel, perhaps on the United States, how do you see that? What is that indicative of? How do you account for the different approach that was pursued by Biden, for example, and Trump in comparison? Kind of the more hands-on, perhaps the more coercive, perhaps, as we've seen in the last couple of days, forcing Israel, forcing Netanyahu to do a couple of things that he otherwise would not do, apologize to the Qatari leader, for example. What do you account that for? How do you explain it?
Well, I think both presidents have been very, very pro-Israel and have been very good for Israel. Biden was really a lifelong, more than just a friend, okay? I mean, for him, it was almost a family relationship. He defined himself as the only Zionist president. The fact that he felt that way, but he came out and said it openly, and said it at a time when he was subject to great criticism within his own party at the height of the war. He deployed 2 aircraft carrier groups and all sorts of other military assets 4 times in the space of the year and a half that he was president while the war was underway. So I don't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that Trump is the best president, most pro-Israel president ever. I don't think we ever had a better friend than Biden. And one of the differences now, Trump has also been very good to Israel in his first term, this term, and fought the first joint war together against Iran. Trump probably has a warm spot for Israel in his heart somewhere. I think he probably does. But Trump is a transactional figure. Trump is about Trump first, second, and last in the end. And I think the prime minister, to put it in maybe simplistic terms, is simply afraid of him. He knew that he could get away with things with Biden that he's not willing to risk with Trump because he knows that Trump can turn on him. And we saw Trump in his first White House visit, was it back in February or March? He announces the beginning of talks with Iran while Bibi is sitting there in the Oval Office. And as you were saying, forcing him to apologize to Qatar now. I think that there's a hesitancy, a caution, which explains the difference in the attitude towards the two.
Thank you so much. Folks, please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I'll try to kind of moderate that and relay these questions. I'm going to take advantage of my kind of role once again and ask you, Chuck, it seems like that the President of the United States has been attributing more and more importance or significance to regional actors that are not Israel. In other words, there's a change or a reshaping of the hierarchy of who matters most as a U.S. ally in that sense. Turkey has been put in. There's talks about F-35s now on the table. Qatar is basically, beyond the $400 million plane that was gifted to Trump. It plays a very significant role. We saw during the public apology that Netanyahu gave over the phone, there was a Qatari representative perhaps supervising. There were talks about Qatar or the president dictating the nature or the language of that apology. How do you see that? Is this a change? Is it tactical or is it tectonic?
That's an interesting question. Look, first of all, Israel was never the only actor on the block, right? The only kid on the block. As a matter of fact, in the early decades, Israel was not the primary actor. People forget today that in the first 2 decades of the relationship, things were coolly correct. There wasn't much of a relationship, and that only starts changing under Johnson. And the very close, first of all, the view of Israel as a strategic ally only starts under Reagan, and the really close alliance really gets underway under Clinton, with ups and downs since then. So we were never the only kid on the block. The Saudis were always a very big kid on the block. During the peace process with Egypt, Sadat was as big a kid on the block as we were. Okay. So there are other kids today, and that's been true in recent years. The idea of moving closer to the Gulf states didn't start with Trump 2. It goes back to Trump 1. It was certainly under Biden. I don't recall at the moment if it was under Obama, but it was certainly under Trump 1 and Biden. Okay. And you see the Gulf allies cooperating very, very closely with the United States. And Israel's image in the U.S. is of an actor that's cooperating less so, or partially. When the war broke out, there was resounding support for Israel in the U.S. But that changed, for correctly, incorrectly. That changed that image. And I think we must do everything we can do to prove that Israel is the #1 ally in the region, and it is a reliable ally. That doesn't mean that we will always do 100% of what the United States wants. One is a global superpower, the other is a small regional power. We have different interests sometimes. That's fine. The U.S. recognizes that there will differences, but we really have to do everything possible to minimize those differences. And when there are differences, to manage them in the friendliest and most effective way possible.
Fantastic. Again, before we turn to talk about Israel, because I see a lot of questions particularly about Israel, I'm still trying to get us tethered to the American. So the United States plays a significant role in Israeli national security. It's a bedrock. It's a major foundation, not only in terms of the provision of advanced capabilities, the qualitative military edge, and so on and so forth. There's a natural, or kind of traditionally, there's an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that is signed, the almost $4 billion. Given the fact that, and you mentioned that a couple of minutes ago, about the kind of diminished or changed perception of Israel within both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, do you see that moving along? Is there a possibility of renewing an MOU that is $4 billion worth of American military aid? Or is it something that is a figment of the past, so to speak? It's no longer there.
You're asking a $4 billion question.
Yeah.
I was about to say $1 million question.
Or 4 billion, yeah.
Yeah. Look, one of these days, the American aid program is going to end. It must. It's been going on. There's been massive aid for 50 years now.
Right.
And I think because of the war, because of the dramatic increase in Israel's defense budgets, this isn't the time to end it or even to cut it back. As a matter of fact, it's probably time to increase it, at least somewhat. But I do think that Israel is going to have to wean itself off American financing of the military relationship. It will always need American weapons, but the financing by the U.S. And the question is when we can start doing that. I think what we should probably do is say that for the current MOU expires in 2028. So what we should probably do is say that we're going to need more aid for the first few years after that. Let's say, for argument's sake, for the first 5 years, but then we will start a 10-year process of reducing it down, of eliminating it, 10% a year for 10 years. I think that's something that would receive fairly strong support in the Congress, in both houses. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure at this point. The Republicans will support it, I think. I tend to think that if it's in that kind of a framework where it's being phased out, we'll still get a majority of Democrats. But this isn't something that was a foretold conclusion for the last few decades, no longer is, and that has dramatic ramifications for Israel.
Yeah, it's no longer a kind of a given as such. Absolutely. We have an anonymous question here, but I'd like to kind of to tie it to kind of one of the comments that you made, perhaps. The question goes as follows. This is unlikely. What do you think? Is Israel's current leader good for Israel or not? But this is a bit provocative, but let's try to kind of to put it in some more tangible terms. One of the most controversial decisions, recent ones, there's plenty of those probably, is the attack in Qatar, the assassination attempt of the Hamas leadership, literally meeting to discuss an initiative. Is that a way? Is this a prism through which we can evaluate Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership in general, perhaps his contribution to Israeli national security in that case, in the context of the war, perhaps long term?
All right. So here, I mean, just for full disclosure, I have to say I am not a supporter of the prime minister's, but I also do try to be fair in my analysis and give him credit where it's due and the opposite where that's due. So first, let's give him credit. The fact is that after the catastrophe of October 7th, where he deserves the blame, or some of it certainly, Israel defeated Hezbollah, defeated Hamas, led to the collapse of the Syrian regime, and then defeated Iran in June. These are all, I mean, at least the defeat of Hezbollah was unreal. There was the beeper operation, for whoever remembers, and then the attack that killed the Nasrallah. We thought that Hezbollah was really this mammoth threat that we had no idea really how to handle. They had 150,000 rockets, all aimed at our home front. We thought the level of destruction on the home front was going to be horrific. And they were essentially defanged in the space of a couple of days. And I don't think anyone believed, anyone who wasn't privy to the closest secrets, thought that we could hit Iran the way we did in June. So he gets credit for that. He was the prime minister when that happened on his watch. But first of all, there was October 7th. And I said before, I mentioned the list of failed assumptions. Well, those are all his assumptions. There was the attack against Qatar, which I think was just a gross misjudgment. And I know the IDF was, for the most part, against it. So I don't know how that error was made. And the prime minister, I believe, has various other failings over the years that he has to take the blame for. Both in national security policy and in domestic policy. For example, there was the catastrophe of, maybe you remember the number better than I do, I think it was 42 people who died in the stampede in Mount Meron at the ultra-Orthodox ceremony for, what is it for? It's not like
it's a burial site for it's a Jewish sage.
And he was found actually responsible by a commission of inquiry for having failed to fulfill his responsibilities as prime minister to prepare to make sure that the police were preparing properly for this event. It's a mass event, everybody knows, takes place every year, and the arrangements were not there for crowd control. That's one thing. I think he bears severe blame for the so-called judicial overhaul, the judicial wrecking ball, for dividing the country, for intentionally using divisive political tactics as a way of promoting his own standing, for perpetuating his term in office. That, and I could come up with a list of all sorts of other things where he's, I believe, made major mistakes. Whether he's good or not, obviously, is a judgment call. I think my own belief here is probably clear.
Alrighty, so historically or not historically, but scholarly, you focus on national security, Israeli national security, and mostly kind of focusing on the kind of the hard side of power, so to speak, military capabilities, cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. But you did mention the fact that Israel's global status has been downgraded, and so there's a couple of questions here from the audience that kind of relate to that, and I'm going to try to tie both from the same guest. What can or should Israel do to improve its public relations image as the peace process moves ahead? And what do you think Israel should do with the returned hostages? In other words, what can you do about this media landscape where Israel, well, objectively speaking, lost the war, so to speak, lost the conflict there? I don't think anybody will dispute that Israel had suffered a major blow there.
Yeah, I don't think that's disputable. Look, I mean, if you ask me, what is the one thing that is critical to Israel's future image around the world and the place that is most important for Israel and the United States, it's the Palestinian issue. If we can resolve that, if we can achieve significant progress, if we can at least change the global and the American narrative, which today views Israel as the primary obstacle to progress, as opposed to the Palestinians, which was the international narrative until a couple of decades ago. If we can do that, then that will change the situation, not 100%, but 80%, because the primary problem really is that the world simply does not accept Israel's policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Long before the war, the settlements issue, again, you can be for or against. No one in the world, including in the United States, accepts Israel's settlement policy. It seems simply counterproductive. If Israel wants to remain a predominantly Jewish and democratic state, and so people just don't understand it. And we've been trying to convince the world for 60 years now, unsuccessfully. That's not going to change. So we have to change the policy on settlements, on the future of the West Bank, and that'll do most of the work. Where there are legitimate agreements, for example, how to go ahead on the Iranian issue, you don't come to Congress and take on the President of the United States in his home court. Not the way to do it. You can express public disagreement if you want, politely, respectfully. Behind the scenes, you can express very strong disagreement, but you don't come out against the president. Okay. You don't do it a second time in the last year. People talk a lot about Israel's poor PR, the failures of Hasbara, as it's called. And
Yeah.
it goes way beyond that. I'm not saying that things couldn't be done better. They can always be done better. And the budgets that Israel devotes to it are painfully small. They're laughingly small. But you have to take into account that there are now a few generations of people around the world and in the United States who've grown up on the narrative, not that, let's say, people my age grew up on, of heroic pioneering Israel and of the heroes of the Six-Day War and Holocaust memory, but people who've grown up with a totally different narrative of Israel as an occupying power, and for many of them, a brutal, racist, apartheid, genocidal occupying power. These people are well, I'd say for the last 20 years, they're already increasingly in positions of importance in government and politics, and will increasingly be there. So unless we change the narrative here, I don't foresee a favorable future.
All righty. David Siegel, who's a very good friend of ours here at the Institute and a supporter of us, is asking, there's a shift in the American Jewish community, the intra-politics or the internal composition or the kind of the landscape of positions with regards to Israel. And he says the following, the American Jewish community was fairly solid behind Israel for the first year after October 7th. This has changed dramatically in the past year with a strong anti-Zionist Jewish community emerging. While this community is frequently accused of anti-Semitism, it has to be regarded as a factor in any U.S. administration posture regarding Israel moving forward. Is this schism recognized in Israel? We talked about the special relationship between the United States and Israel, and part of that specialness is the existence of a robust, very supportive American Jewish community. Do Israeli policymakers, are they aware of this sea change that we've been witnessing in the past couple of years? Obviously, it started before that, but certainly this has peaked now.
Look, there's a lot of intentional denial going on. So the right will deny that, oh yeah, there have been ups and downs over the decades, so this is another down. Yes, we recognize that, but now the war will be over and everything will be fine again. I think that Bibi is much too sophisticated and knows the U.S. Too well to believe that that's the case, that this is just another down. And I think people on the left or the center are aware of it. Certainly leaders are. And the issue does receive coverage in the media, not enough. And I don't know that I don't think people are fully aware of just how bad things have become. But let me also say here that I want to, having put some blame on the Israeli side of the picture, I want to put some blame on the American Jewish side. And it's one thing to be critical of Israeli policy. Lord knows I've been extremely critical for decades of our policy. It is another thing to say that you're now anti-Zionist or that you don't support the state of Israel. You don't have to support the government of Israel. You don't have to support its policies, but supporting the state of Israel and its security and its right to exist and its right to exist as a vibrant Jewish democracy. Anyone who can't bring themselves to say that wholeheartedly, it's not just a lack of agreement on my part, it's a lack of respect. 80 years or 80 something years after the Holocaust and just about 80 years since Israel's rebirth after 2,000 years, people who can't identify fully, wholeheartedly with the state of Israel, you know something, I have a very impolite suggestion what they could do to themselves. This is not acceptable given Jewish history.
All righty. During your presentation, you talked about the two-state solution or the viability of the two-state solution. So we have a question from the audience that kind of relates to that. Can Israel continue as a Jewish and democratic state if there's no two-state solution and the population as a whole includes both residents in Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, both Israel proper and Palestinians, that is? And I would kind of follow up with that with an addendum, so to speak. So if not a two-state solution, what is the next big thing?
Well, I think, first of all, if we don't separate from the Palestinians, then we can't remain a predominantly Jewish and truly democratic state. Certainly not the kind of democracy that we want to be. That doesn't mean that the two-state solution, the classic two-state solution, a Palestinian state on 100% of Gaza and almost 100% of the West Bank, living in peace next to Israel, that's not I don't think, the only answer at this point. And I think that the likelihood, for the reasons that I said before, the likelihood of that happening at any time in the foreseeable future and probably ever is very, very low. So now I'm talking my own personal beliefs. I've been playing around for the last year with a number of ideas. I'll mention maybe just 3 of the primary components. The primary component is to go back to the old idea of a Jordanian-Palestinian confederation, which is essentially 2 independent states that have agreed to join together and to share their foreign and defense policy. Everything else is independent. No, all domestic policy is independent, and they will be recognized as 2 separate states. But they will share the defense and foreign policy, and at least, let's say, for a transitional period of a decade or so, the Jordanian component would retain overall control. They'd have the final word in defense policy and in foreign policy, so that Jordan's got a good record. That would give Israel the confidence might give Israel the confidence that it needs to make the territorial concessions that I said otherwise no one believes are still viable from a security perspective after October 7th. That's the primary component. A second component is Gaza in its current borders, and this isn't a political statement, it's a socioeconomic one. Gaza is not viable in its current borders. The population today is 2.2 million, give or take, and is doubling every 20 years. So in 2045, we're going to have 4.5 million in Gaza, and 20 years after that, it's going to be 9 million. That means that we have to do one of two things: either reduce the size of Gaza's population. Trump had proposed the idea of relocation back a few months ago. Not a realistic option. There is a more realistic option, is to increase Gaza's size. And there are a number of proposals how to do that. And I think for lack of time, unless you tell me otherwise, I won't go into the details, but there's an idea called the multilateral land swap, which would double or triple the size of Gaza and give Israel some territory that it needs in exchange. And the third component, and this might be the first step, and I think this is the most that you could sell to the Israeli public, including the left, for the foreseeable future. It's, by the way, what Yair Golan, who's the head of the most left-wing party in Israel today, is saying, is we can talk today about civil disengagement from the West Bank, not military disengagement, meaning that Israel will disconnect from, let's say, 90% of the West Bank on a political level, but the IDF will remain deployed for military purposes throughout the entire territory until we can reach a final agreement.
Alrighty, we're almost out of time, so I'd like to just circle back once again, just to close this conversation, and perhaps look forward, kind of into the future. How do you see the Trump's policies now trying to reshape the geopolitical, geostrategic landscape in the Middle East? How do you evaluate the chances, the prospects of him kind of expanding and enhancing the Abraham Accords to include both Saudi Arabia as well as other regional actors in the Gulf and beyond? Are we now in a better position to see that happening, or is it going to fizzle out eventually?
Well, the deal that was signed was a precondition for any of this happening. And the president came into office with a desire to expand the Abraham Accords, and both for strategic reasons and because I think he personally very much wants a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize. The war, I was saying before, at best postponed and may have derailed normalization completely. I think he'll put a lot of pressure on the Saudis and the others today to go forward. They'll need some time before they can. It's not as if, okay, the agreement was signed and tomorrow they can go ahead. And they'll need, until now, they've said they had changed their pre-war position, which was just some sort of vague progress, to wanting a dramatic breakthrough. Maybe now they can walk that back a bit, but they're going to need significant progress before this can happen, I think. And maybe even before the attack on Qatar, they were already less trustful of Israel as a potential ally against Iran than they were before the war broke out. Concerned that maybe Israel had become too strong in the region from their perspective. And then the attack on Qatar did something to them. They understood that Qatar wasn't being attacked, it was Hamas, but if you can conduct an attack in Qatar, and maybe you're saying it's not against Qatar, but you can do it against us also in the future. So I think there are a number of breaks. I think the president will try for a variety of reasons. And let me just end on a hopeful note and say I very, 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 very much hope that it happens, because normalization with the Saudis would be a dramatic turning point in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Absolutely. All righty. Thank you so much, Dr. Freilich. It was a pleasure as always. I'd like to take advantage once again of this opportunity and remind us all that the next webinar titled Between 2005 and 2025, the Israeli Disengagement from Gaza 20 Years Later, will take place online Tuesday, October 28th, 12:30 p.m. Eastern. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. Chuck, my friend, always a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us
Thanks
today.
very
Thank you
much
so
for
much
having me.
to the audience who joined us today as well. Take care.